You remember Din Ben Phu? No. The same thing happened in Algeria, in Africa. They didn't have anything but a rancor. The French had all these highly mechanized instruments of warfare, but they put some guerrilla action on them.
Hello and welcome to a Guerrilla History Dispatch. Guerrilla History is the podcast that acts as a reconnaissance report of global proletarian history and aims to use the lessons of history to analyze the present. I'm your host, Henry Hakamaki, and I'm joined by only one of my co-hosts, unfortunately today, Professor Adnan Husain, historian and director of the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. Hello, Adnan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Henry. It's great to be here with you.
Absolutely. And just to remind the listeners briefly about what dispatches are, because I believe this is only our second one. Dispatches are going to be shorter, more informal episodes that take a look at more recent events and try to situate them historically, rather than taking a deep dive into history like we do with our full episodes. So unfortunately, we're not joined by our other co-host, Breht O'Shea, today, but we do have an excellent guest lined up for us. We have Branko Marcetic, who is a writer at Jacobin and who recently wrote an article that Adnan, you and I both independently found when we were trying to find, some information about the Pandora Papers. Branko's piece is titled CIA Op or Not, The Pandora Papers Are a Big Deal. And again, that was in Jacobin. Adnan, why don't I turn it over to you briefly before we open up for Branko to give your opening thoughts on why we were looking at the Pandora Papers. And I think it was a little bit funny that we both ended up with this exact same piece independently of one another.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Henry. And it's really great to have Branko here to talk about this article and the larger issues. But the reason why I came across it was, I think, because I was trying to situate some kind of comparison in the history of different major leaks that we've become used to of, the operations of the global financial system and how tax havens are used to hide and move money, and how whether what we were learning from the Pandora Papers was in line with or different from previous such leaks like the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, and even more broadly, as a historian, I'm interested in the question of sources, source materials, evidence, how you use it to interpret and understand, create these narratives of the past. And these seem like extraordinary evidentiary resources. And so how we respond to them and interpret them and use them is going to be very important. In figuring out how we can really track and understand global capitalism during this period, how it's operating. So I was interested in somewhat the politics also of these releases, and that's how we came across Branko's article. So let me welcome you in, Branko. Thanks for joining us today to talk a little bit about it.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
Well, I wondered if maybe you could just start with any kind of overview that you want to give about this latest leak, the Pandora Papers, its scope and what you've been noticing about what it seems to reveal.
Sure. The Pandora Papers, as compared to the Panama Papers, which were based on leaks from one particular tax dodging firm, essentially. In this case, it's a leak that encompasses several different offshore services firms. And so it's, I think, a lot broader. And the people or the countries implicated here are billionaires and public officials, elected officials across a whole swath of different countries. I believe Ukraine has the most number of politicians implicated. And then you've got Russia, which has the most number of nationals implicated, so, billionaires and the like. And you've also got a few different other things. Brazil is in there quite a bit. Some other South American countries, I believe Argentina is named in there. You've also got notably the Czech Prime Minister was implicated. Maybe we can talk about that a little more, or at least go into some of the implications of that later. And I believe there was one Chinese official that was named, at least the last time I checked. What is interesting and what I noticed about it, and that prompted me to write this piece partly, is that there were very few American officials. And in fact, I think the only major American names in there was a pretty obscure billionaire. And that's it, which is interesting. At the same time, it's not that the US was completely excluded. So there was revelations about how states like South Dakota essentially were or are operating as tax havens. But crucially, there's no big embarrassment for US officials or some of the really famous American oligarchs that we might expect, and that kind of, I suspect that there may be a reason for that, but we can't be sure. But it is a very interesting thing, because when you think about a lot of the corruption that is reported on in Washington, you would expect that some of these firms, or at least that there would be a firm included that would service some of these individuals. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. I wonder if it's a matter of these particular firms were not ones that worked with U.S. billionaires and politicians, or if it's a matter of, I mean, it's hard to know without some real forensic, examination, or whether this, this leak was somehow a curated leak, like not all the documents and not all the clients who worked with these 14, I think it was, firms, was released. I mean, this is hard to know, but I'm wondering, what's the thinking about why there's such a disparity? Because that is a striking disparity that you pointed out.
I'm going to jump in and piggyback there for one quick second. Just that was also the first thing that struck me, of course, when the papers came out, is that there was so few American officials. And, the first two things that came to my mind is, well, we know that American billionaires and oligarchs and business leaders and politicians are funneling money into tax havens. We know that they're doing all types of shady business practices. We know that they're hiding their assets all over the place. But, there was two things that came to my mind is maybe there's just some places in the US that are such tax havens themselves that, you don't have to use these 14 firms that these foreign individuals are using, because the United States has so many tax havens within the borders anyway. Or, the curation issue that you raised, Adnan, was, of course, the other thing that immediately jumped to my mind is we know that American politicians and billionaires, oligarchs, business people, we know that they're corrupt. So how could it possibly be that we don't see their names there, other than the fact that they were intentionally excluded from these lists?
It's a very good question. And as you say, yes, there's definitely an alternative explanation, in the sense that, exactly, it's very easy to dodge your taxes if you're a US billionaire or multimillionaire. We found that out with the IRS leaks earlier in the year, which showed that people like Jeff Bezos essentially were completely legally getting away with paying basically nothing in federal taxes. And in some cases, actually getting money back from the government, which is incredibly outrageous. So in that sense, you'd think to yourself, what would be the reason to use an offshore services firm? At the same time, obviously, the fact that there is one billionaire named in there, one US billionaire, it suggests that there are some people using this. And also another explanation people have thought is, well, maybe the particular firms that are being used by Americans are not in this particular leak. But to me, I mean, it's very convenient, and you ask yourself, okay, then how is it that those firms go excluded, or why? Perhaps there's some sort of logistical or practical reason for that, or maybe there's another reason. I thought about some of the comments in 2016 when the Panama Papers were leaked from a former financial whistleblower, Bradley Birkenfeld, and he said he didn't know. Again, this is all speculation, but he said that it's very interesting that there are no Americans named in the Panama Papers. Yet at the same time, who was embarrassed by those leaks? Putin, or at least a lot of Putin's inner circle, rather than Putin himself, Brazilian officials, the PT party at the time going through this massive corruption scandal that would ultimately lead to its toppling from power and the rise of the far-right Jair Bolsonaro, who's in power now. At the time, the US had embarked on the sort of anti-corruption campaign in Brazil, we now know, and other countries. So very much sort of in keeping with that campaign. And also Chinese officials, kind of members of Xi Jinping's inner circle family, that kind of thing. And certainly people like David Cameron also was embarrassed, although he was not really directly implicated, at least in terms of while he was in power. But it was embarrassing for him. And Bradley Birkenfeld, he sort of proposed this idea that, well, he might have just been collateral damage. If this was a hack and dump attempt, he was collateral damage. And in fact, there were two journalists who made this case later, I think in 2017 or so, that even if we don't have evidence for it directly, Putin himself did believe that the Panama Papers were a US operation, and may have played into the motivation for him to do what he did in 2016, allegedly, but almost certainly, to hack the DNC emails, hack Clinton's emails, and leak those as a sort of retaliatory effort. The other thing that I would point out, the second thing that kind of raised alarm bells in my mind, is there was a piece of reporting in, I believe, 2019 by Yahoo News that talked about the fact that Trump, quite apart from this whole narrative that Trump is taking on the deep state and there's this war between Trump and the CIA and the like. I mean, there's truth to that for sure, but Trump very much gave gift after gift after gift to the CIA and what they wanted to do. And one of those gifts, this report revealed, was that in 2018, he had loosened the rules around basically how the CIA could do exactly these kinds of hack and dump operations. Not always dumping, sometimes just hacking. Sometimes, if they wanted to wreak havoc on a country's energy systems, for instance, go after Iran's nuclear program. But also they mentioned that it was to do these exact kind of things where they hack into government services, leak information about it that's very embarrassing or damaging, and kind of cause some trouble for the country, whether in practical terms or whether in terms of its public image. And when you look at some of the stuff that has come out with this, recall that Ukraine, which I said had the most amount of politicians named, including the president, the Biden administration has been pressuring Ukraine to tackle corruption, which it's sort of been dragging its heels on. It's caused a bit of friction between the two countries. And then you look at the fact that Putin was very directly embarrassed by these leaks. It's not far-fetched. It's not confirmed. It's speculation, but it's not far-fetched to believe that this could be part of a US effort to kind of embarrass these various countries or push them into certain directions.
Well, we hit a lot of different things in that answer, and I know that we're going to want to get back to the political ramifications in a second. And Adnan, I know that you have some things that you want to say on that as well. But before we dive into the political ramifications, because I think that'll be just about the majority of the conversation that we have here, I just want to make sure that we mention how these leaks were portrayed in the media. So maybe let's take a comparative look of the Panama Papers versus the Pandora Papers versus, as you mentioned before we hit record, the DNC leaked papers. I haven't been following the story as closely as you have, obviously, but I have been following it a fair amount, and I can feel a different portrayal of each of these leaks from one another, not just like this one is distinct from the other two, but all of them have kind of been distinct from one another in more ways than one. Can I just kick that back over to you, Branko, and see what, again, you've been looking at this far more than I have. What is your assessment of the portrayal of each of these leaks?
I would say the thing that stuck out to me the most is that in Washington, when there is a leak of some kind that's damaging, whether to public or private interests, there is usually a kind of howls of outrage from elected officials. There's calls for investigations, for prosecutions. This is certainly what happened when the IRS leaker, whoever they may be, they revealed all this tax dodging by billionaires. Very embarrassing. Immediately, there were calls to find who had done it, to prosecute them and throw them in jail. That's been the pattern, since Bush, but really escalated under Obama. It's been continued by every president since, this war on whistleblowers. If people remember the FinCEN files, which were basically revealed that banks, multinational banks, U.S. banks, were involved in or enabling money laundering, drug trafficking, all sorts of nefarious things. That whistleblower, she was this year sentenced to a prison term, even though this was, by all accounts, is one of the major leaks and leak investigations, in recent history. It won prizes, journalism prizes. Strangely, none of that in this case, even though some of that, the stuff that was in the Pandora Papers was damaging to the United States. If you think about, the cases I mentioned before, those states acting like tax havens. And the other thing that's really different in this case is that since the 2016 leaks, the DNC and Clinton emails, which a lot of journalists and a lot of people in general, I think, believe shifted the race and led Donald Trump to win the election in 2016, there's been this, in my mind, very disturbing narrative among the press that basically maybe journalists should not have reported on this stuff. And maybe in the past, people need to, working in journalism, need to kind of rethink how they report on these things. Perhaps it's not really important to report on damaging information that's revealed by whistleblowers, because that could do more damage or not, which I think is should be completely contrary to how any journalist does his or her job or thinks about reporting. But this has been the prevailing narrative. The idea that you might cause political damage by reporting on it. Now, there's been no concern about any sort of political damage, as there shouldn't be, from these leaks, even though, for instance, the former Czech prime minister, he was directly implicated in these leaks, and he lost an election, almost certainly because of the embarrassing details that were named. Strangely, no one seems to be talking about, the responsibility that or that journalists have to report on these leaks and how they should be careful because of, wider ramifications, which, again, I want to reiterate, that's exactly how people should think about it. And to me, it's kind of a reflection of this very nationalist mindset that's infected the press since 2016, that this idea that American journalists should be thinking about U.S. interests first and not about, things like holding power to account, achieving justice, reporting the truth, that kind of thing. So those are really the things that stuck out to me when I look at the reaction to this leak compared to others.
Well, you mentioned since 2016, but in some ways one could also suggest that that attitude goes back before when it comes to national security leaks and reporting. Certainly, of course, with the original WikiLeaks, Iraq war logs and, the very famous video and so on. At that time, the intelligence agencies characterized WikiLeaks as a foreign intelligence service, and wanted to characterize it not as a journalistic enterprise in any shape or form. And all of the portrayal that you've mentioned of these particular different periods of leaks and hack and dumps or just hacking, sort of cyber war and information war, there's clearly a pattern going on here. In which journalism is being implicated in one way or the other, but not in a very consistent way, as you've pointed out. So I think that's something to really think a little bit about. What is the proper approach to this? These may be damaging, pieces of information to, U.S. U.S. rivals and so on, but nonetheless, this is important information. So how do you think journalists should, you've mentioned a bit, but how do you think journalists and activists, maybe even more than journalists, since activists don't have quite the same constraints or interests that journalism has? Journalism, you're pointing out, they should be pursuing the truth, and it doesn't really matter who it aids or harms. But for left activists and activists globally, there's been some caution about, are we participating in some kind of CIA operation? Are we achieving goals of U.S. intelligence services, if in fact that's the provenance of it? What do you have to say to this? What guidance should we look to for this?
I mean, I think that in the sense that any of these leaks can help us to take on tax dodging, to claw back the wealth that is constantly being hidden and grown around the world, that really should be recycled back into national economies. I think that's important. I think it is important for people to be aware that perhaps their political leaders are involved in this, and to have that in mind, perhaps when they're voting. I think for activists, because I think for journalists, none of this stuff should really play into their minds. Perhaps it's something that they might want to note the context of. That's certainly an argument that people in the U.S. press have made since 2016, that whenever a leak is reported, you got to sort of note that this could have what geopolitical implications it will have, and which countries it might help, and who might be behind it. Not really saying that they've stuck consistently to, but okay, that's an argument that's been made. But I think for activists, what I think we should be wary of is how, for instance, in Brazil, I mentioned with the Panama Papers, this really fed into this kind of anti-corruption zealotry in Brazil that ultimately put the far right in power. And that's not because we should completely ignore corruption or dismiss its importance. But in that case, in the Brazil case, this was a very selective use of anti-corruption for political partisan ends that ultimately was used to whatever faults it might have had, to destroy the PT and take it out of power, and basically create the conditions for the far right to come there. So I think in that sense, activists need to be cognizant of that context, and not necessarily take ignore corruption or take a lighter stance to tax dodging, but be careful not to turn this into some sort of moral crusade that ends up helping kind of U.S. imperialism or far right campaigns.
Yeah, interesting thoughts there. One other thought I had about the previous issue about the kind of politics of the release and provenance, of the Pandora Papers being leaked, is that while it also may assist in embarrassing and undermining political rivals, geopolitical rivals of the U.S., for example, around the world, it also is a pretty good advertisement at the same time. The fact that there weren't any, we may have identified that South Dakota is a place but it's almost an advertisement that, the U.S., just as Henry mentioned, has plenty of tax shelters and havens, so keep your money. Your ill-gotten gains will be kept, safer in U.S. hands than going to Bermuda and these other, offshore or Switzerland and so on. So that's just sort of a perverse thought that occurred to me, is that, there may be some economic, reasons as well for the slanted demonstration effect, you might say, of this leak.
It's not something that came into my mind, but it is a good point, I think. It honestly will depend on whether the Biden administration actually does what it's saying, about cracking down on tax dodging. So far, that I don't know, those efforts are looking pretty wishy-washy. If they follow up on it, then you could say that if this is a CIA operation, perhaps it was in the aid of kind of Biden's domestic agenda. And if they don't end up doing anything or do very little and kind of just do a surface effort that kind of lets them say to the public that they've tackled the issue without really doing it, then I think, you could say what you're saying, that maybe this is just a way to say, hey, don't put your money over here. Come to South Dakota, come to these other Midwestern states.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And something else that maybe isn't super well connected to that previous point, but something that is just kind of sticking in the back of my mind is that it's very interesting that we have these leaks like this that are exclusively financial documents, right? We have really nothing that's connected to like actual government going-ons rather than just financial things. And I find that to be very interesting because we know that if you were a hacker who was looking to embarrass the United States, you might want to just look at the government itself rather than, this one random billionaire in the United States. But of course, we have to remember that the Espionage Act is weaponized against whistleblowers that try to do anything that questions U.S. governmental, goings on, as it were. So I'm not really quite sure where I'm going with this thought. It was just something that was in the back of my head, is that, we have all of these papers coming out exclusively on financial things, and to the benefit of the United States, as we've been kind of kicking around by and large. But, if somebody was a hacker that wanted to embarrass the United States or embarrass another government, you'd probably just look at what the government itself is doing. And that's not something that we really see outside of the WikiLeaks, the WikiLeaks cables and whatnot. And look what's happened to Julian Assange since then. It's kind of this silencing of any sort of systemic opposition to government goings on, so that we really only get this kind of veneer of shedding light on ill doings financially from these random billionaires and oligarchs from other countries around the world.
That makes me think, to add to my previous answer about how exactly we should think about these things, and to not get caught up in kind of, one or another country's intelligence operations and geopolitical goals. I think a good way to think about this and to think about how to calibrate some sort of political response is, rather than doing the kind of Brazil-style selective anti-corruption crusade that really is just about toppling one particular government and then just putting in something completely different that's still corrupt. We should look at these leaks, whether it's the FinCEN files, whether it's the Pandora Papers or the Panama Papers, or every other leak about tax dodging and all this kind of thing, as it's revealing a system. And it's a global system. It's not just a national system. And obviously, there are going to be national responses within the country's borders that have to happen to tackle that. But there also has to be a coordinated global effort, similar to what the countries of the world are doing right now, led by the US, to create a global corporate tax rate. And it's a similar thing. I think this has to be tackled. You have to curb this global system of tax dodging, rather than just saying, as happened in the Czech Republic, well, we'll throw this crook out and we'll put some others in. That's not necessarily going to solve the problem. It just sort of punishes one bad actor out of an entire ocean of them. So I think that would be a good way for us to think about how do we act in this, because the stuff that's revealed in this, whether or not it plays into some country's hands or not, it is scandalous, and we should be scandalized by it. The sheer amount of wealth that really is being stolen from societies, and also the fact that so many people that are in the political system are just completely, if not complicit, directly a part of it.
There's one other brief thing that I want to say before I let Adnan transition us to a different topic, which is, you just mentioned that, these are convenient that we can kind of look at these individuals without looking at the systems that are in place. And one country that immediately comes to mind here is Ukraine, which, as you mentioned, is one of the biggest countries in these leaks that came out right now. And what people have to look at is over the past, well, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, really, Ukraine has had essentially the highest levels of corruption of any country in the world consistently on a year-by-year basis. But we've never had a reckoning with that, as it were. We have individual politicians, generally the president, who will get thrown out and corruption will be weaponized against them. So, we had Yanukovych. This happened with him. Poroshenko, the same thing happened with him. Now, the current president, Zelensky, he won in large part because he wasn't a politician, didn't have this kind of background that would make people think that he was corrupt. And he ran on a platform of anti-corruption, and he swept into office pretty handily. And since then, what have we seen? The systems that were in place in Ukraine continue to chug along unimpeded. We see continual corruption going on in the country still under this anti-corruption campaigner. We see him being implicated. We see many, many people around him being implicated. But these papers do allow for a rather useful way to superficially, just axe the one person at the top and say, okay, corruption's gone, no more problem. But without really ever examining the root causes of corruption within these countries. And Ukraine is just a very illustrative example in my mind. Branko, if you have anything you want to say on that, otherwise, Adnan, I know you have something that you want to transition to.
I completely agree with you. And as you say, looking at this as just a matter of getting rid of one person at the top and then replacing them with someone else is clearly not going to do the trick. It has to be something much more systemic and broad-ranging. I guess one thing I would add before we transition is I think the other thing to consider is along with the fact that we know the CIA, whether it was involved in this leak or not, we know the CIA does similar kind of hack and dump operations. That's easier for it to do it now. And I think you mentioned Julian Assange. One of the ironies of this whole thing is that the U.S. government maintains a kind of, a stable of hackers, people who are informants and assets in the world of hacking, who would then uses to do this exact kind of thing. And in fact, even at the same time as it's kind of going after Assange, and it's a very threatening thing to press freedoms here in the United States and globally, on the basis that, well, he's not a publisher or a journalist, he's a hacker, and that's criminal. Well, the US the US government is the one doing hacking on a much more prolific scale. Not that Assange did any hacking. He simply publishes the things that people leak to him. But it's the US government that does the hacking. And not only that, but we found out earlier this year from a report in an Icelandic paper that, in fact, part of the operation against Assange by the US government, by the Obama administration, was that the FBI used one of these hackers that they used as an informant. They had him hack the Icelandic government to create the pretext for the FBI to come in to then arrest Assange, because they couldn't actually go after Assange in the country until they were given permission to enter the country. So this is, there's so many layers of hypocrisy going on here, and not just hypocrisy, but really, really deceit, because people are told to fear hackers and how bad they are, and they're using this as a way to clamp down on press freedoms. Yet at the same time, who are the most prolific hackers in the world? It's Washington and other intelligence agencies of different governments around the world.
Absolutely. Just on a slightly earlier part of this same thread of conversation is just to point out that the large scale of these leaks and the multiple leaks since the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and now Pandora Papers, I think underscores the point you were making, Branko, about how this is a systemic question or problem. It's not related to just a particular case of corruption in one country or this country or that can be solved immediately by removing, the ruler or getting back the funds owed taxes from the particular billionaire. I mean, my first reaction to it before all of these other discussions about the slanted or biased characterization of the results was just that this shows, as it's been increasingly evident, that this is a systemic, problem. The problem is capitalism as it operates globally. It's not a question of corruption. It's not that the system has been corrupted. It is a corrupt system endemically. And so I think recognizing that is very important, particularly because of the responses and reactions that you were pointing out, is that the anti-corruption discourse is one that is narrowly cast in such a way that it often feeds right-wing populism and is really on the left, globally speaking. We have to be able to articulate and organize a broader, more systemic confrontation with what's really endemic about how this global capitalist system is working, and not just targeting, particular nefarious actors that we might identify through these, which is why the work needs to be done. You alluded to something that sounded kind of interesting about global, corporate tax rates, but something that requires solidarity and organization on a more global scale. It seems to me that's what we've been missing the last couple generations or two. Corporation with neoliberalism and globalization, and the corporations and capital has been able to move pretty easily globally, but we've not found the ways in which we can organize against it on a similarly global basis. So I'm wondering if maybe we might turn to thinking about, well, what do the Pandora Papers allow us to see? And what might be some of the consequences that we could look forward to and work towards in terms of the kind of accountability and justice that we want to see?
Well, as you say, this attempt to pass a global tax rate, I think, is a potentially a model for something that should be done on a whole host of other issues. I mean, there's so many things that I think, because of the hangover from the nationalist movements of centuries ago, that kind of organized us into these self-contained little groups that we call countries. We still think of everything as a national problem. We don't think of our global society as one thing that's interdependent and that requires working together. Maybe we're starting to see a change in that. This global tax rate thing really is a different idea. And if it succeeds, it could be a model. It could spur momentum for more movements in this direction. Climate change obviously is the absolute number one biggest issue that we are facing as a society across the world. It will be great to have cooperation on that. And as you say, countries around the world right now are working to close their borders, to shut more people out at exactly the time that people are migrating all over the world. They're being pushed around by climate disasters and all manner of other things. And people are working to narrow their path to get in. Yeah, at the same time, money is just able to flow around completely freely. I think that's completely topsy-turvy. I think you should let people move, and you should, if we're going to can sustain this system of distinct countries, then wealth should stay in the countries where it's produced, and go to the benefit of the people that produce it. And if so it should be the opposite way. But okay, if that's the way it's going to be, if governments are going to continue to keep their borders tight and to shut people out, then it's fair to say, at the very least, then why aren't we doing the same with this wealth that's being generated? Why is there not a global push to put a squeeze on these offshore services firms and to make it impossible for people? Because this is what you talked about with the North Dakota example, that if this is some sort of kind of covert advertisement, like, hey, actually dump your money here, you can hide it here pretty safely. Well, that's exactly what a considered global effort would prevent from happening. Same as a global tax rate. By making sure that no country can undercut the other, you are essentially eliminating the incentive and the ability for people to essentially really steal wealth and hide it and accrue it for their own personal gain. So hopefully that's where the conversation goes in the next months and years. I guess we'll see.
Last question, Branko, before we wrap up. So basically all I'm going to do here is just take the title from the article and phrase it into a question for you. So again, listeners, you can find this article on Jacobin's website. It's CIA op or not. The Pandora Papers are a big deal. And we've spent most of this, 40 minutes or so talking about, probably a CIA op, and it's almost certainly slanted in a way that benefits the United States. We've been talking about this entire time, but I think it's worth reiterating the point that this is still a big deal. So why don't I just let you have the floor for as long as you want to talk about why this is a big deal, what activists can do with this information, et cetera, however you want to take it.
Sure, I won't be very long because I think I've mentioned a lot of it, and actually having this conversation, I wish that I'd made this point in the piece, but there you go. Maybe next time somebody hacks some financial services firm, I can write that piece. I think rather than just looking at this as we throw some of the bums out, maybe we put some people in jail, and then we just continue this horrible system that's really leading people to make these kinds of decisions. We should look at this as a big deal because it's one more revelation of just how corrupt this entire system is, and it shows that we need to start taking steps to keep wealth within our borders, at the very least keep wealth within the places or within the communities that produce it, and that's going to take global action. It's not going to be throwing out the Czech prime minister or throwing out the Ukrainian president is not going to do it. That's sort of just punishing one bad actor who got caught with a hand in a cookie jar. You're really going to have to take aim at this entire system that we have that allows people to just squirrel away massive amounts of wealth that, by the way, could be utilized for the most urgent crisis that's facing humanity, which is climate change, which is going to take a massive amount of investment. And if countries are not willing to run big short-term deficits to do it, well, guess what? All this money is sitting around there that's being hidden in these offshore firms. Maybe it's time for us to claw back and use it to save humanity, save this planet, and hopefully build a more prosperous future. We've clearly that's been able to be done for these Build Back Better plans in response to the pandemic. The pandemic of anything is a flawed but important kind of model for how countries, the world, can actually take considered global action to fight against something that threatens all of us on this planet. And we should take that model. We should fix the flaws and avoid some of the worst things about it, and adapt that to not just climate change, but tax evasion, global tax rates, everything that affects all of us on this planet.
Excellent. Again, listeners, our guest was Branko Marcetic. Branko, thanks for coming on the show. Can you tell the listeners how they can find you on social media, find your recent writings, and whatever you want to direct the listeners to?
Sure. You can find me on Jacobin Magazine, jacobinmag.com. And you can also find me on Twitter at bmarcetic. A little bit of weird spelling, but there's not many people with my name, so I think you'll find me pretty easily. And I also host a podcast where we talk about New Zealand politics. I'm from New Zealand originally, and as well as global politics. It's called One of 200, so oneof200.nz. So give that a go, see if you like it. I think that's probably about it.
Excellent. I will spell your last name for you, just so the listeners do know. It's Marcetic. Adnan, how can the listeners find you on social media and your other podcasts that you run?
You can follow me on Twitter at Adnan A. Husain, 1SAIN, and check out the Majlis podcast about the Middle East, Islamic world, Muslim diasporic affairs. If you're interested. And I just want to thank Branko very much for coming on. Terrific conversation. And, if you write that article with extending the points you made right at the end, hopefully we can have you come back on and talk more about that as well.
Very much appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
And listeners, just since we're on the topic of strange spellings, Majlis is Majlis, Adnan, so listeners can find that. Listeners, you can find me on Twitter at Huck1995, and you can find Guerrilla History on Twitter at Guerrilla_pod. That's GUERRILLA_pod. You can also support the show on Patreon, patreon.com/Guerrilla History. Again, GUERRILLA. Until next time, solidarity.